Welcome back to week 5, Bible in a Year, and we're going to get through the book of Exodus and into Leviticus. And as we begin this journey, reading through all of this, I want us to keep a few things in mind. First of all, know that Israel is going to struggle a lot with idolatry, a lot of sin. We're going to see the tabernacle constructed. We're going to get introduced to God's law. So I want to cover first and foremost 4 major highlights that we need to be aware of as we're reading through. The first one is the incident with the golden calf, Israel's idolatry, that we read about in Exodus 32. Israel rebels against God by building this golden calf idol. It's a pivotal moment. Moses is on top of Mount Sinai getting the law from God. The people are down below. They create and worship this idol. This breaks this covenant that they just made with God. And this event really showcases humanity's tendency to replace God with things that seem tangible. And God's response in all of this is to forgive through Moses' intercession, which ultimately points forward to Christ as our mediator. Next, number 2, we have the departure from Mount Sinai. We're going to read that in Exodus 33 through 34. So after the golden calf incident, God reaffirms his covenant. In all of this, his presence is seen still by the cloud, the fire, and he continues to lead Israel. Number 3, next, we see the construction and the use of the tabernacle in Exodus 35 through 40. Pay attention to each item that is here in the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant, the altar, everything in there, because it symbolizes God's presence and his plan to dwell among his people. So important. This completion of the tabernacle, ultimately, we see it with God's glory filling it up. It's beautiful to read. Get ready for that. And number 4, lastly, we get introduced to God's law as we move into the book of Leviticus. I want to stop and encourage you for a moment. Keep reading. It's fascinating, trust me. And there are a lot of things that we're actually going to come back to later on as we go through the Bible. So pay attention to this book with interest here. As we dive into Leviticus, God's laws, they're laid out to establish holiness among his people. So along with those 4 major highlights, here are 3 key themes I want us to keep in mind. First, God's law and its relevance for today. The laws given to Israel are a reflection of God's holy character. They truly are. And so while we're not under the old covenant ceremonial law, the moral law, the civil laws of God still apply to us today. Next, this theme that we see of God's patience and forgiveness. So important. Despite the idolatry, rebellion of Israel, God shows patience with Israel, giving them a second chance through the renewal of the covenant. And so lastly, number 3 here, we see God's judgment, his justice. The golden calf incident reveals the severity of sin, the consequence of disobedience, and God is a God of justice. We're going to see that. And finally, in all of these readings, let's keep in mind this supernatural worldview as we're going along. And here are a few things to track along the way in regards to that. First, when we go back to the idolatry, think of this in the terms of spiritual battles. The golden calf incident isn't just a rejection of God, but it reflects humanity's pull towards false gods and their spiritual influences. We're going to get to Deuteronomy later on, but Deuteronomy 32:8 reminds us that the nations are handed over to these principalities after Babylon, and idolatry often reflects their influence. Next, number 2, we have God's presence in the tabernacle. This cloud, this fire representing God's presence, but ultimately at the tabernacle we see his presence. This is signs of his nearness. And this ties into the ultimate fulfillment of God's presence in Jesus, where God dwells with humanity, and later, as we're experiencing now through the Holy Spirit as believers. And finally, number 3, the priesthood as a reflection of Christ. The establishment of the priesthood points to Jesus, our ultimate high priest, who intercedes on our behalf. And the priests of Leviticus, they foreshadow the perfect mediator who bridges this gap between a holy God and a sinful humanity. This week's readings remind us of God's holiness, His patience, and the seriousness of sin. The tabernacle points to Jesus, where God's presence is ultimately going to dwell through Christ's Spirit in us. And as you read this week, reflect on God's justice, His mercy, them working together, and how these themes shape our understanding of God's character. And don't forget in all of this, like, comment, subscribe for more videos, share your questions in the comments, and we'll see you next week as we continue the Bible in a year.